It's the Jamie and Stoney Show, 97.1 The Ticket. Jamie Samuelson along with Mike Stone. Our next guest is a guy I'm proud to say I've known for, good God, Stoney, almost 20 years, give or take. No.
It's got to be longer than that, right? Pretty close.
I was class of 93 at the great Northwestern University. He was class of 96. His senior year was the year Northwestern went to the Rose Bowl. And now we could be looking at Northwestern going to the NCAA tournament. He, of course, is the host of Late Night with Seth Meyers on NBC, former head writer and Weekend Update host on Saturday Night Live, the one, the only Seth Meyers. Seth!
How you guys doing?
Doing good.
How are you?
25 years. It's been 25 years since I met you.
Well, I maybe not 20, maybe, yeah, give or take. You arrived.
I was 18. I was a freshman when we met. I was 18. I'm 43.
I didn't want to date you, Seth.
Now, Seth, when you met Jamie, your fraternity brothers, was Jamie one of those guys, like the father figure of fraternity? Yes. Was he or was he kind of like a geeky nerd like Revson?
Very real father figure until you realized a year or two after he left that he was never going to pay us back the money that he borrowed. Ripped us off. He was the kind of guy that would rip you off.
No, I was. You know what I was actually, and probably the only reason Seth would agree to call into the show right now is that I was a nice guy, and so I was nice to the freshmen because when I was a freshman and some guys were not nice, I thought they were jerks. So I tried to pass it forward or whatever. So I was trying to be nice.
That is true.
So I think Seth thought I was a nice guy, which is the only reason he would probably ever return my calls. That's probably more accurate,
I remember
right?
saying, I appreciate this kindness. If there's anything I can do for you 25 years down the line.
I appreciate that very much. So, Seth, we ostensibly wanted to get you on to talk Northwestern hoops.
Yes.
And I emailed with you yesterday, and you said, hopefully we'll be talking about a big Northwestern win. Now, I know you have another job that takes up some of your time, but did you get a chance to watch any of the game last night?
I was at dinner with my wife, so I was checking the phone and then kind of relieved that I wasn't watching it.
It was awful. I mean, it just was terrible. I feel like they're doing everything in their power to play their way out of this thing.
Yeah.
So,
heartbreaking.
If they go, will you go?
I will go if they have to play on Friday because I have a show on Thursday, so I couldn't make that first Thursday game.
It's worth calling in sick for. It's only national television, Seth.
Yeah, have Fred host.
Exactly, Fred could fill it. But I would love a Friday I could go, I think. I'm praying for one of the direct flight locations from New York, I will say. And it's rare to be in a position where you're praying for Indianapolis.
That's what I'm praying for, actually.
You can drive there, Jamie.
Yeah.
There is
Indianapolis would be perfectly nice.
I don't know. I mean, you work, obviously there's a Northwestern contingent in your industry, Colbert being the prominent name in addition to you. In sports casting, it's borderline absurd. And I think it's gotten to the point now where this should be like a fun Cinderella type story. And I think there's starting to become a backlash because people are getting annoyed by the Wilbons and the Greenbergs and everybody, jumping on the bandwagon. So I kind of like this. We're kind of like the black-hatted Cinderella in a way here.
I agree with that. It's also crazy. No one ever seems to make the distinction of all these people are in sports that went to a school that was terrible at sports for most of their time there.
Yes.
So I guess maybe that's what it was almost like they were swinging a bat with a donut on it, learning how to cover sports at Northwestern, and that's what made them so good on a national stage now.
They saw so many bad sports that they knew good sports when they saw it, and they knew how to talk about it, perhaps.
Exactly.
Seth Meyers with us. He's, of course, the host of Late Night with Seth Meyers and a college fraternity brother of mine way, way back in the magical decade known as the 90s. So, Seth, I wanted to ask you about the president.
Yeah.
And you're familiar with his work.
I am.
It's funny. I actually heard an interview that President Obama did on his way out with some of those guys who worked for him. And they asked the rhetorical question, are we responsible for President Trump? Because they were this team of writers that wrote President Obama's comments at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, where you were the MC, and you, of course, legendarily roasted then businessman Donald Trump as well. They came to the conclusion they were not responsible for the President Trump presidency. And I'm sure you've addressed this or been asked this question as well. Have you given that much thought?
Well, it's funny because, and I made this very clear in the show, this is not the outcome of the election that I thought was going to happen. I was 100% wrong of how this was going to break.
Same.
And so in the lead up, when people were writing articles about how Obama was the one who made Trump run from the Correspondents' Dinner, because I thought Trump was going to lose, I felt like I wasn't getting the amount of credit I deserved for also being a part of that. The day Trump won, I came to the conclusion that it was not my fault. But I do think President Obama probably pushed him to it. I don't want any of the credit anymore.
Has his campaign and presidency been good for the comedy industry?
I don't know. I feel like that's such a selfish way to look at it. I will say this. We were very concerned that, and again, it's early days, although it seems like it's been a year. We thought the audience might have an exhaustion to hearing about him every day, which so far they haven't. There seems to be an appetite for people to want to see us talk about this stuff. Hopefully it's as cathartic for them to hear us go through it as it is for us to talk about it every day. But, again, your biggest fear when you're doing a show every night, I'm sure you guys feel the same way about having to do your show every day. Your biggest fear is when you have nothing to talk about, and that has not been the case at all.
Well, exactly. And in fact, last week you had a thing you did, a closer look, where you literally put a shredder on your desk and shredded up a bit you had already written because of the presidential press conference last Thursday. Is that right?
Yeah, so that broke it. He did that press conference at 2 in the afternoon, and the stuff that we had worked on all day felt like it was a month old. To go out, sit down in that chair, and talk about anything other than that press conference felt irresponsible. So that has never been the case. And again, we've only been doing our show for 3 years, but there's been nothing like that that's happening now with regularity. We also, tape at 6:30. We finish at 7:30, and then the show airs 5 hours later. And in the first month of this presidency, there's been stuff that, we tape it, and then we go home, and then in those 5 hours, somebody like Michael Flynn resigns, and the show seems like yesterday's newspaper by the time it airs because, stuff is happening in that 5-hour window, which was never the case before.
Do you find it strange that a lot of the things that he has criticized, whether it be the failing New York Times, the Washington Post, Saturday Night Live, CNN, since he's ripping on them, their ratings, subscriptions have gone skyward. He's been great for these companies.
Yeah, it's certainly been a boom time for SNL, and I'm really happy for my old friends and colleagues out there. I feel like they've handled this post-election better than the show has ever had before. Although it's interesting, I remember when I went through 3 elections at the show, and it was always really exciting to write about elections and campaigns because there's all these things like debates sort of self-generate stuff. There was always a hangover after the election because then it actually got down to governing, which is fairly boring when it comes to comedy. So this now, for SNL to be on the upswing after an election, which is usually a dip time, is a full credit to Donald Trump. If he ever releases taxes, I think we'd find out he has a lot of stock in NBC Universal. This is all working out for him.
Seth Meyers with us late night on NBC. Late Night with Seth Meyers every night at 12:30. And, of course, the way television is now consumed, a closer look usually makes its way around the Internet for days afterwards as well. I heard you interviewed on Howard Stern. I think it was within the last 6 months. I think it was when Trump was a candidate. You were on there with Fred Armisen and Bill Hader. And you mentioned that you actually had seen him. And I think it may have been at the SNL 40th or something like that. Because he really shredded you after that Correspondents' Dinner. And look, Stoney and I do our show every morning, and we get ripped all the time. And I have incredibly thin skin, and Stoney has incredibly thick skin. When Trump rips you and says a terrible comedian, all this stuff, did that embolden you? And what was the exchange like when you actually saw him again?
Well, it was hilarious to me how he ripped me after the Correspondents' Dinner because I appreciate that he didn't like it. I grant him that, but it was pretty well received. I did I don't want to tip my own cap, but it went well.
It went very well.
And so then he was on saying, I was a third-rate comedian. I have marbles in my mouth. I would actually argue I'm a pretty verbal comedian and pretty good at saying words.
Yeah.
But, so I thought it was really funny, and it was great because that year he wrote a book. I think he, at that point, was writing a book probably every year, but there was a chapter where he referred to me as this third-rate comedian, and I think I got 10 copies sent to me that Christmas by different friends who wanted me to have a book where I'd been slammed by Donald Trump. But then, I saw him at the SNL 40th, and I think he was very happy to be there. I think he's the kind of guy who likes getting invited to parties that he considers classy. And we passed each other on the way to our seats, and we actually had a very nice interaction where he basically admitted that he did not mean those things that he said. And there were no hard feelings. And we actually were talking about having him on the show back then. That was, I think, February. He probably announced June. So there was a 4-month window where everything was good with he and I again. And then, of course, he decided to run for president, and that sort of derailed it.
Have you ever seen him laugh?
No. And I'm glad you asked that, because a lot of people have said, and again, I understand that Trump supporters would have every right to say this to me. After he won, when they reference the 2011 White House Correspondents' Dinners, they'll say, who's laughing now? I guess he had the last laugh. And I want to say, no, I'm still laughing far more than he is, because I've never seen him laugh. And when he hosted SNL in 2004, 2005, I can't quite remember when it was, there was no sense of humor on him. And again, I actually think he's funny. I think, before he won, I thought the way he talks in interviews, there is a inherent comedy to him, but I think it's accidental, because even when you'd read sketches that ended up being good sketches on the show, he never laughed unless other people laughed. I felt like he took his cues off everybody else.
It's funny. There was a big profile of Al Franken in the New York Times about a month or so ago, and he made that same observation. He's never seen him laugh. I think the only time I ever heard him laugh is at that prayer breakfast a couple weeks ago when he was making jokes about Schwarzenegger and his ratings, and it was such a bad joke that nobody else laughed, and it was very uncomfortable.
That seems like 100 years ago, but he opened a prayer breakfast and made fun of Arnold Schwarzenegger's ratings, because what is prayer if not a time to air petty grievances? Right.
Do you guys have, now we're dealing, I didn't want to deal all with Trump, but my last question on that is, do you and your team, do you guys have like a sign or some inner throttle or something where you say, okay, we'll know it's over when blank happens? Like, because you're right, the news is writing itself every day with him, and there is bits coming out of everything, whether people agree with his politics or not. It's certainly notable how it's happening. So have you guys talked about when you're going to know it's time to maybe move on to another topic?
Well, we take our cues off the audience, and I will say this, and this is probably a distinction we recognize more than the audience does, but the monologue where we start every night and we do 10 jokes, say, is very different than the closer look where we sort of take a deep dive into an issue. The appetite for the closer looks seems very strong, because I think people do want, to some degree, to hear exactly what happened and what it means. Mm-hmm. Because, I think a lot of people who watch our show haven't spent as much time on Twitter or reading websites that we have all day, and they kind of want to have a quick catch-up. The monologue jokes, which is just 10 jokes to open the show, we have noticed that if the first 5 or 6 of those are about Donald Trump, the audience at some point, I think, gets a little sad, because it really starts hammering home the reality of the current situation. And so that's where we're trying to find, things outside of the presidency and outside of politics to make jokes about right off the top of the show. And again, though, we just are sort of taking their temperature every day, the audience, and I can't imagine what we've seen for the last month, both in how he's governing and how we're talking about it, can maintain itself for 4 years. So we'll see.
Seth, we really appreciate the time. It's great catching up with you, and hopefully I will see you at the Final Four.
You'll be there, right? You'll go to the first game.
I'll do my best, yeah, because, I mean, I know you're a Red Sox fan, you're a Steelers fan, and you're obviously a Northwestern fan, so you've pretty much had it all. This is the one thing still left on your sports resume, I think, right? This is the one thing left. And I will say, not being a big basketball fan and not having a college basketball team that ever plays in March, this is being an incredible bridge for me between football and baseball season. Yes,
I have needed it my
carried
whole
you over. That and the Trump presidency.
That too.
All right. Hey, Seth, thanks a lot, man. I appreciate it.
Always a pleasure, guys.
All right. See you soon. Seth Meyers from